All right, everyone, here we go with part 2 of today's lesson. We'll be looking at decolonization in Africa. Now, I know this may sound like a deviation from the Cold War, but in reality, today we'll talk about how, in fact, you cannot divorce decolonization in Africa from the Cold War. Now, obviously, there's more going on there than just that, but it is still related, and we want to make sure to kind of look at all the corners of the globe that were impacted by the Cold War to fully understand why this was such an important event in world history. So real quick, what is decolonization? Well, that sounds pretty obvious. It's the process of becoming free from a colonial status. But the bigger question is, why did decolonization happen in Africa when it did? Well, a lot of it has to do with both world wars. Okay, if you guys remember when we looked at India had been kind of trending towards decolonization after World War I, and it fully happened at the end of World War II. Same thing was happening in Asia. Those two events were kind of the catalysts for decolonization to happen for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about in a second here. Mostly, the main idea was just an ideological disconnect between the goals of the Allies in World War II, right? The Allies said, hey, we're going to stop fascism because it's wrong, because people have the right to pick their own government, all at the same time having their own colonies, right? The French, the British, the Americans all had colonies. And so this kind of went against that ideology. And so at the end of World War II, there was a lot of calls and demands for independence in these previously colonized countries. While some happened peacefully and smoothly, the vast majority didn't, because even though many of these nations realized there was a need to let go of these colonies provided a ton of income for these nations, especially in the post-World War II world, when a lot of nations that were involved in World War II were suffering financially. They did not want to give up their colonies. But as we'll see, decolonization happened, and it does have a lot to do with the Cold War. So let's move on to our next slide. Okay, so why decolonization occurred? Well, it's important to note that there are kind of steps to it. So in Africa, first we have this growth of nationalism. That grows in African countries after World War II. Nationalism is this kind of belief that you and your fellow people, whether it's because you have a shared ethnic group or language or religion or all of those, right, that you belong as your own country, that you shouldn't be separated or ruled by someone else. Okay? Many Europeans were reluctant to keep fighting to hold on to these overseas colonies. Again, like I said, this went against kind of the ideas of World War II for the Allies and, freedom and self-determination. Many African leaders began to use this idea of Africa for Africans to push the Europeans out of Africa. These African leaders started to become organized. They started to make their own political parties. Strikes, boycotts happened. Okay, a group of leaders formed African Unity in 1963 to promote peace and independence, and eventually this idea of Pan-Africanism started to take hold. And this idea was kind of this notion that Africans, despite their differences, have a very shared history of being dominated by Europeans and exploited by Europeans, and that they'll be stronger by being unified as one group, as one Africa. Now, that never fully happened, but the idea played a large role in the independence movements. Like I said, and I'll be brief here, post-World War II played a large role. It contradicted the idea of the Allies fighting against Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy by saying, like, oh, those governments are wrong because they don't allow for freedom and they don't allow for self-determination, right? Along with that, over 200,000 Africans had fought in World War II for the Allies and helped them fight for their own freedom and democracy from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. There's a very clear contradiction here and irony. And many of these Africans never got any sort of recognition when they came back to Africa after World War II. And so they came back and kind of said, hey, if we can do that in World War II for the Europeans, we can do this for ourselves. And so it was many of these veterans who actually helped spark these independence movements in Africa. Whoops, I didn't want to go all the way there. Sorry. Okay. So after 1945, at the end of World War II, we have this huge spark of anti-colonial movements in the various African colonies, which would later become countries. Now, there were sort of three patterns that happened, okay, across the world. One were the violent revolutions and civil war. This happened mostly in the colonies in which there was either a large population of settlers from Europe. So, for example, Algeria, there's a lot of French people living in Algeria. Okay, Vietnam, there are a lot of, well, there's a good amount of French living in Vietnam. Angola, there are a lot of Portuguese living there, right? Or places in which there's just a lot of tensions, like China, right? So these turned into huge revolutions and civil wars: China, Algeria, Angola, Vietnam. Okay. Then there were the non-violent negotiated independence movements: India, Ghana, Turkey. These were countries that, yes, they were colonies, but there wasn't such a huge amount of the colonial settlement there, people from that country moving there, right? And so it was a little bit easier to sort of transition from colonialism to independence. Now, India obviously was not that easy, as we learned about earlier, but there was the actual independence movement was non-violent, right? There wasn't a war between India and Britain, although the actual process of creating India as a country was very violent. And then we have places in which it was sort of a mix of violent and non-violent. So, for example, Kenya, the Congo, Egypt, South Africa, those were kind of mix or blends of the two. Now, Cold War. So, both sides of the Cold War, the Soviets and the United States, wanted to sort of play a role in independence, and they saw independence movements as a chance to spread their ideas and to spread their influence. The Soviets were pushing the anti-colonial movement and offered assistance. So any country that was sort of fighting for freedom, so for example, Kenya, this happened a lot, Ethiopia too, right? In these countries, they were fighting for freedom from their colonial leaders. And the Soviets were like, well, hey, we can help you out, become free, but maybe you'll join our side, right? The US sort of did the same thing, right? They wanted access to African markets, which were closed because they were controlled by the colonial powers in Europe, and they wanted to prevent the spread of communism, so they would support the opposite side. So we have some of these proxy wars that happen in Africa, right, that are very much a part of the Cold War. The West oftentimes refused to help the nationalists, right, because the West, right, the US didn't want to upset the French or the British because they were on their side in the Cold War. So they wouldn't help out the nationalists who were fighting against the French and the British. And so many of these countries, they would then turn to the Soviet Union for their assistance in fighting for freedom, and therefore support the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War was also about getting more people, more players essentially on your team, on your side. And so in Africa, there was a bunch of nations that were essentially undrafted, and both the Soviet Union and the US were trying to get them on their side. Okay, here is a quote from the Prime Minister of Britain, Macmillan, in 1960. He said, this is South Africa, he said, "The wind of change is blowing through this continent, and whether we like it or not, this growth of a national consciousness is a political fact. We must all accept it, and our national policies must take account of it." And so we start to see the end of these empires. The British Empire, the French Empire, they're starting to crumble at the end of World War II for a variety of reasons, as we already mentioned. Okay, the process was, I would say, rather swift historically. Okay, in 1952, we see these white minority-ruled areas, the white. Okay, by 1962, most of Northern Africa has become free. 1982, basically all of it except for the south, and then by 1994 all of Africa is free from colonial rule. Okay. Ghana was the first under Kwame Nkrumah in 1957. His was one of the most peaceful revolutions in Africa, and it gave hope to a lot of other African revolutionaries and kind of independence movements that this would be done peacefully and well. However, in reality, there were a lot of challenges along the way that made it unlikely for this idea of Pan-Africanism and this like sort of non-violent independence movements to really become the norm. Now, there are sort of three phases of decolonization. 1957 to 1973 was most of West and East Africa, and then phase 2, 1974 to 1994, sorry, two phases, 1974 and 1994 was Southern and Central Africa, as we saw on the previous maps. Okay. Now, in phase 1, we saw this sort of optimism and compromise. Okay, there was some violence, but it included mostly these various examples of peaceful, smooth transitions of power. Okay, colonial powers maintained some control over these former colonies because a lot of these transitions happened through negotiation rather than war, right? So a lot of the nations still had some sort of control, but they were done peacefully. Okay. Phase 2, though, was much, much more violent. It was much more about liberation, social transformation, and this was the one that was tied closely with the Cold War. The nations that were allied with the US or the USSR, right, they were fighting because the US and the USSR were also fighting to prevent the other side from winning. And so we have much more violence in these in the second phase of decolonization. Okay. Like I mentioned earlier, there are 3 major routes: peaceful, negotiated, like in Ghana; violent in the settler colonies, where there are a lot of settlers from the European colony or country, like Kenya and Algeria; and then these incomplete, in which rather than creating true peace and freedom for the majority population in that country, we have white settler minorities gaining power. So in South Africa, the British said, okay, you're free, but there's apartheid, and basically there's a division between the whites and the Africans. And even though South Africa was free, it wasn't truly free for the vast majority of people who lived in South Africa. Okay, so results of decolonization. Well, decolonization was, like I said, in some cases smooth, in some cases not. Okay, the British and the French were slightly smoother, generally speaking. Algeria was not very smooth, and Kenya was not very smooth, but for the vast majority of the French and British empires, it was a little bit more smooth because of there was a sort of transitional period. Okay, they educated some native elites, so people from Kenya, people from Algeria, right? They were educated. There was a sort of transitional period of native people having representation in the government before the French and British pulled out, and there was a sort of minimized possibility of conflict between the various ethnic groups in those countries. In places that were controlled by the Belgians, like the Congo and the Portuguese, colonies that were very exploitive, right? They were just taking the resources without any sort of giving back to the colonies. There was no schools set up. There was no sort of economy set up there that benefited the colony. That's where we had the most violence. That's where the transition was the worst. And so that's where we saw the most of the problems in decolonization. Okay. And there's also a lot of internal challenges and hurdles, right? There were tribal allegiances, right? Not the boundaries in Africa were drawn by the Europeans, right? And so you may have had a country that was, hey, this is, whatever, this is Kenya, this is Rwanda. But in reality, those countries were made up of smaller ethnic tribal groups that didn't necessarily get along and didn't see eye to eye. Okay. There was illiteracy, right? These education systems were underdeveloped because the Europeans had no interest in educating the Africans. They had interest in taking their resources. There was no tradition of political leadership by those groups, right? And so those political systems had not yet been developed and formed. There were religious differences. There was diverse geography and climate, which made sort of Pan-Africanism very difficult. And there were established social hierarchies that were created mostly by the Europeans, in which there are various groups, and it was unlikely for them to coexist peacefully. Okay, we have a variety of genocides in Africa. As we see, all of these blue shaded areas are places in which the UN sent peacekeeping missions throughout 1945 to 2009. Most of them are in Africa. Right, and a lot of that has to do with the policy and kind of poor policies of decolonization, which led to conflict, eventually genocide, which we'll talk about later on. Okay, economic issues also were prevalent in Africa. Like I said, these countries were not developed; their economies were not developed for independence. They were developed to create wealth for the European countries, and so they're either stuck with just kind of cash crop agriculture and taking resources and selling them to Europeans, or they had to take large loans to modernize their economies, but a lot of those loans were taken from countries like China and the Soviet Union, who really just wanted to have control of Africa, not really to help out Africa. And so the countries of Africa weren't ever really given true economic freedom either. Okay, we have a lot of corrupt political parties and leaders because they were supported by the US or the USSR or China or whatever, and these were just really people in looking to have control for themselves rather than creating true freedom and happiness for their people. Okay, so ultimately we have a lot of pain and suffering in Africa at the end of World War II and through decolonization and as part of the Cold War. So your task for today is, in a paragraph, how did the Cold War and decolonization impact Africa, and what were the results? All right. Thank you, guys.